Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 319, a special episode following up on an earlier episode I did about a year ago called 10 Records to Start Your Jazz Collection, which was not my idea. It was actually my wife's idea, and it's actually the best liked and most watched video, pound for pound, that I've ever done. So anyway, the other day we were talking about it, and I said, geez, how do I follow that up? And she said, well, what about 10 more records? Which is not a bad idea, because really, who's going to stop at 10? So in doing this video, I want to stick to the same principles that I kind of stuck to in the first one, which was as follows. First of all, price and availability. These have to be records that somebody can get hold of for not crazy money. So what am I defining as accessible or affordable? Well, basically that you can find a few copies of it for sale, which are a very good plus or better for $30 or less. And by copies, I mean real, properly released, canonical copies. So if it's a Columbia record that actually is put out on Columbia Records, it's not on Vladimir's RussianWax.com or one of these other kind of copyright-free gray market releases. It's not a CD rip, it's actually a proper release. Not necessarily a first pressing, but it's canonical. Secondly, the record has to be pretty accessible to the novice jazz buyer. So there's lots of great stuff out there, which is pretty cheap and pretty available, but is going to be kind of a shock to the system, and that's not the idea. So no acquired tastes here. Third, in terms of the physical media, I'm focusing on long play 12-inch records, which of course rules out some cool stuff like 10-inch records and 45s and so on, and 78s and shellacs, but a lot of those tend to be a little bit obscure and a little bit expensive, so see point 1. Fourth, in this list of 10, I'm going to try and hit on the major styles, but I'm not going to hit all the styles. Why? Because there are more than 10 styles of jazz. And fifth, and maybe most importantly, I'm going to be recommending individual titles, individual records, not records by a particular artist. Why is this? Well, one good reason is that certainly the major artists tended to migrate from style to style to style as their career progressed. So for instance, a Miles Davis record, which was recorded in the late 40s and early 50s, now this is Birth of the Cool, a rather well-loved copy of it, released later on, and actually with a much later picture, but this was recorded around 1950, sounds way different, in fact, unrecognizably different from this record, Sketches of Spain, which was done with Gil Evans and released in 1960, fundamentally a different kind of sound and a different kind of record. And those two in turn are going to sound unrecognizable if you put on Bitches Brew, which is in the early peak of his electric period, and is probably about as different from Miles's early work as any other jazz record could be. Similarly, John Coltrane, 1957, debut record, rather different from this one from 1965 or 66, I forget, 66, Ascension, which again, if you put these two records on side by side and ask somebody who knew nothing about the music to say if it was by the same artist, they would suggest that it probably was not, but it is. So huge migration. And then another example of this, Herbie Hancock, sort of modal, hard bop influenced jazz from the early 1960s, very, very different from his work in the 1970s with his Headhunters band. And there you can see Herbie in the 1970s. Looks a little bit different from the Herbie of whatever it is, 1962 or 1963. And the music is very different too. So all that to say, talking about individual records, not talking about particular artists, because you might love one artist in a particular period and you might not at all like that person's product 10, 15, 20 years later. In fact, I would say that of the records I've shown you, it's the rare jazz fan that likes all of those records, or at least likes them equally. Most people have their preferences for one era or another. So to summarize, here I'm focusing on easily acquired 12-inch records that are not too expensive, that are representative of some of the major post-war styles, but not all of them, and with an accent on accessibility to new listeners. I'm not going to go over all the jazz styles here again, but I will say that I do have a separate video on figuring out the different styles of jazz in the post-war period, which I'll link to at the end. So in the second video, I'm going to try and stick reasonably closely to the organizing themes I used in the first one. And so I'll begin with that great era of music from the mid-1950s, characterized by a plethora of recordings which you can largely lump under hard bop, which basically, if there's any kind of music or any one representative moment of modern jazz, this would be the moment. It's the time of all those great Blue Note releases, all those great Riverside releases, all those great Prestige releases. And last time I talked about Miles Davis's Bag's Groove, and I also talked about Art Blakey's album Monin with the Jazz Messengers. This time I'm going to recommend this record. Clifford Brown and Max Roach, known as Clifford Brown and Max Roach, and they had a quintet. And Clifford Brown is interesting. If you think of Dizzy Gillespie as the great trumpeter of the 1940s, the person who really was part of that 3 or 4 strong group, along with Parker and Monk and Bud Powell, who really blew the whole bebop thing wide open. If you think of Dizzy as the great trumpeter of the 1940s, well, who was his heir apparent in the 1950s? Well, over the span of the next few decades, clearly Miles Davis stands head and shoulders above everybody else. But that wasn't necessarily obvious in 1955. And the other people who really were considered to be heirs apparent to the title of the greatest living jazz trumpeter included Clifford Brown and also included Chet Baker. And so I've decided to highlight this particular record, which was the debut of this particular quintet. Absolutely fantastic and very much just like Bag's Groove, actually, kind of on the cusp between bebop and the emergence of hard bop, and not least because Max Roach, quintessential bebop drummer, is on this record. But as much as Roach is great, as much as Harold Land is great, and later on in this quintet's relatively brief lifespan, Sonny Rollins' contribution was also fantastic. The key reason to gather any of this quintet's records is Clifford Brown and his tremendous trumpet playing. Now, having mentioned this record, I'll also give you an honorable mention or an alternative suggestion for this particular period of hard bop, and that would be this record by Sonny Rollins, Way Out West, which is a very interesting record because Sonny, well, first of all, it's a great record. Secondly, it's a trio, which was kind of unusual. It was a pianoless trio, and Sonny had made it while out in California. He was basically buttonholed by Lester Koenig, who was the owner of Contemporary Records. And so Sonny, one of the quintessential East Coast hard boppers, was paired with some West Coast players on this, and the results are really quite spectacular. Anyway, totally recommend picking up, frankly, both of those. Now, I want to talk about West Coast jazz. Now, when I talked about West Coast jazz before, I gave an example of the Dave Brubeck Quartet's record, classic record, Time Out from 1959, although really, that's actually, in retrospect, not that representative of West Coast jazz. The other record I suggested, which was the Jerry Mulligan Quartet featuring Chet Baker, is actually representative. And I've got a bit of a curveball here, but the great thing about this record is, well, there are two great things. It's really cheap, and it's also really good, and not a lot of people actually recognize it for being as good as it is. And it's this one, called somewhat generically West Coast Jazz in HiFi. So it looks like, oh, okay, this is some kind of compilation, but it's actually not. It's a record which features, two leaders basically, Bill Holman and Richie Kamuca on tenor sax, and a whole bunch of other really super West Coast jazz stalwarts, including Vince Guaraldi of Charlie Brown Christmas fame. Anyway, this record is slightly more notorious for being released under a different name with a different cover, Jazz Erotica. But despite the cover, which I have to blur out in order for YouTube to actually be able to show this video, this is not that sexy a record in terms of the players. It's just a bunch of homely white guys, but the music is really quite terrific and is very representative of the West Coast sound that was coming out of Pacific Jazz, out of Contemporary Records, Fantasy, and those other labels in LA and San Francisco in the 1950s. And as I mentioned, not only is it a good record, but it's also really cheap. Another record which flies a bit under the radar, but which is also really good and quite representative and reasonably affordable, is this one. Not this particular version, which is a first pressing, but you can get later pressings, Barney Kessel's record, To Swing or Not to Swing. And this is put out in Contemporary. Barney Kessel, again, probably not that appreciated these days, kind of forgotten almost, but really one of the great jazz guitarists. And here he's really in the process of being one of the folks that's helping to develop the whole, essentially the alphabet and the vocabulary of jazz guitar, the jazz guitar that we now know today. Okay, this is how George Benson or whomever, how these other people play. Those kinds of forms were being developed by people like Barney Kessel. So anyway, that's recommended. So now the third category of jazz records that I wanted to talk about was vocal jazz. And the last time I recommended I think, a collaboration album between Sinatra and Antonio Carlos Jobim. And I think I also mentioned Sarah Vaughan's Swinging Easy. This time, I want to mention a record which is becoming increasingly sought after and famous, but you can still get decent copies of it for not too much money, although, again, this one is the Acoustic Sounds repress, which is a little pricier, but you can get certainly some of the later 70s, 1980s MCA Impulse represses you can get for not too much money, which is this collaboration record between John Coltrane and Johnny Hartman, which revived one career, which was Johnny Hartman's career. Hartman was a friend of Coltrane's, and his career was kind of in the doldrums, and Bob Thiel at Impulse said to Coltrane, who do you want to record with? And Coltrane says, Johnny Hartman. But it also, this record did a bit of a favor for Coltrane's career, or at least it was part of a quid pro quo with his label, because Coltrane at this point, this is put out I think in 62 or 63, was moving rapidly ahead of public taste in terms of the music he was recording. And within 2 or 3 years, he'd be recording stuff that a lot of people would really be rebelling against. And the critics were already starting to rebel against his music in the clubs. And Coltrane and Thiel had an agreement that Thiel would record what Coltrane really wanted to play on some other records, like Live at the Village Vanguard or so on. But he would also do a number of records which were basically right down the middle of the pipe, softball kinds of records, which were very, very accessible, but which were nonetheless, because of the quality of the players on them, fantastic. And this is one of them. He also does one with Duke Ellington, and he also does a record called Ballads. So anyway, Hartman's performance is great, and Coltrane and his quartet underneath are just super. So strongly recommended. And another one, not really in the same vein, but definitely a vocal jazz record, but also a bit of a weird record because this person sometimes sang and sometimes didn't, is this record by Chet Baker. Chet Baker sings It Could Happen to You. Sorry, it's a bit glossy and hard to see the cover. Not to be confused, incidentally, with this record, Chet Baker Sings, which comes earlier. This is a little bit later. And actually, in a lot of ways, this is a superior record to Chet Baker Sings because Baker's singing voice is maturing, or at least his technique is maturing. And it's also interesting because here, Baker came to prominence on the West Coast, but here he's actually playing with some well-known East Coast hard bop players. So the people backing him up on this record are Kenny Drew on piano, Philly Joe Jones on drums, and the contrast between their slightly harder edge playing and Baker's own really, well, his singing is kind of like his trumpet playing. There's not a ton of vibrato and very long, clean lines. It wasn't everybody's taste, but I personally think it's excellent. Anyway, strongly recommend this record. And again, you can get this for not too much money, as long as you're not too fussy about what the cover looks like or which particular era it was reissued in. Now, next I want to talk about modal jazz. And last time I think I talked about Bill Evans, and I of course mentioned the most famous modal jazz record of all, Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. Shout out this time to Crescent by John Coltrane. Now this is a strangely unappreciated record. Certainly if you look at the resale market, you can pick this up for really not very much money. I don't quite understand why this is, because if you were to ask serious Coltrane fans to list their 4 or 5 favorite Coltrane records out of the whatever it is, 25, 30, 35 that he put out in his career and posthumously, this would make the top 3 or 4 for most people. It's the record that comes out, I think, immediately prior to A Love Supreme, and he's on his way to finding that sort of transcendent moment that he gets to with Love Supreme. But there are some really wonderful, wonderful moments on here, like the title track, Crescent, and also the song Wise One, Bessie's Blues. Really, there's not a weak moment on here, and it's a really tremendous record by one of the giants of the field, and it's typically not very expensive. So I say, grab it. If you're into that modal thing, another suggestion, you could pick almost any of McCoy Tyner's. McCoy Tyner, of course, was, amongst other things, the piano player for the John Coltrane Quartet in the 1960s. And after Coltrane's death in 1967, he then releases a whole bunch of records for Blue Note. Many of them are excellent. There isn't really a weak one, but the one that I just wanted to highlight here is this record, Expansions. His technique is continuing to develop here, and the cast of characters supporting him, I mean, really, Ron Carter is on cello, Wayne Shorter is playing tenor sax, Gary Bartz is also on here, Woody Shaw on trumpet. So it's A-listers all the way as sidemen. So again, McCoy Tyner expansions, solidly recommended and available for not too much money. Now, spiritual jazz. Last time out, I talked about Alice Coltrane's Journey in Satchidananda and Pharoah Sanders' great record, Karma. Those are really amongst the great classics of the field. This recommendation is a slightly less well-known record, but I would say really in the same caliber. And that is the debut record by Lonnie Liston Smith on Flying Dutchman, Astral Traveling, which is named after a song which Smith wrote and first performed on a Pharoah Sanders record, but he then goes out on his own when Bob Thiele starts his own record company, Flying Dutchman, and this is his first record. This is some fabulously groovy, trippy shit. And I would say the first 3 or 4 outings by Lonnie Liston Smith, not to be confused with Dr. Lonnie Smith, are, if you're into that really groovy, spiritual, sort of tripped out, astral kind of sound that those late 60s and early 70s Impulse records had, then this is an obvious next step and can be purchased for not too much money. Now, I've talked about a lot of older records here, but I wanted to mention a couple of records that are more recent in what you might call the spiritual jazz vein. Don't get me to define that too rigorously because it's a bit slippery as a concept, but you know when you hear it. One is this record, very, very recent, by Nala Sinephro, and this is called Space 1.8. I think it's been repressed. This is a repress, but it came out, I think, only a year or two ago, the original version. It's kind of ambient and synthy, but it has some extended, what you might basically call spiritual passages as well. It's music to do yoga by, but I don't mean that as something negative. It really is uplifting and very peaceful and tranquil music, but in no way is it soporific. And I also wanted to talk about another record, which is quite recent, although this is a bit of a hybrid because it's a very recent record by somebody who has a long career and has sadly just passed away, Pharoah Sanders. And this is the record that Pharoah Sanders did with the, whatever he is, DJ type guy. There shows you how contemporary I am when I use phrases like that. Floating Points. And the LSO, although their contribution is not really particularly memorable on here, but Sanders' contribution is just superb on this. And as his last record, what a way to go out. So again, this can be gotten for, well, somewhere between 20 and $25 new these days. And while it may not be the greatest thing that Sanders ever did, it certainly gives you a great sense of what he was still capable of and gets you to a place of tranquility, which is kind of the point of a lot of that music. Now a little section on Latin jazz. And the last time I talked about Ray Barretto, the wonderful conga player, and his record Acid. I also talked about Cal Tjader and his record Mambo with Tjader. I'm going to mention a record I actually reviewed quite recently on the channel, which is Willie Colon's record, The Hustler. And this is Willie Colon's first record with the wonderful singer Hector Lavoe. Colon, of course, is a trombonist. They're in the middle here of busting open the very sort of trendy or ultimately short-lived fad in Latin music in New York in the 1960s called Boogaloo, and creating something which was more credible, had more roots in traditional rhythms, and ultimately laid the groundwork for the dominance of salsa in the 1970s. Tremendous record, super exciting record, lots of real variety on this record, and strongly, strongly recommended. You can probably find a copy which is less beat up than mine, but this one sounds okay. It's on Fania Records. I like a lot of that great music. And another one, now this might seem a little bit odd because if you're of a certain age like me, you'll remember Eydie Gorme as somebody that was often referenced on the Carol Burnett show as kind of a Broadway singer, which, ultimately she did a lot of. But this record, Eydie Gorme, Canta en Espanol con Los Panchos, Trio Los Panchos. Now, Trio Los Panchos were basically a trio romantico, purveyors of traditional Mexican boleros. And while Eydie normally sang in English, she was fluent in Spanish, and here she sings Spanish lyrics, and the results are excellent. This is cheap like borscht, this record. For some reason, it seems to be the kind of thing that people think is, okay, this is like a, dollar store or Value Village bin flipper. But really excellent, excellent music. And at some point, I think these are going to become more scarce. So I would say grab it. Now, from Latin, it's a quick skip to the right to Bossa Nova. And this time I'm going to highlight, one of the great Bossa Nova records, Jazz Samba by Stan Getz and Charlie Byrd. This is the record that creates the Bossa Nova craze. There are other records which are arguably maybe better, but there is no more important Bossa Nova record with respect to the impact of Bossa Nova on the wider world than this record. And in particular, the hit song on here, Desafinado, and Getz's incredible interpretation of the music of Antonio Carlos Jobim. This is one of those records that if you're going to collect Bossa Nova records at all, you kind of have to have, unless you want, people whispering about you. And having talked about a very famous one, I'll talk about a record that doesn't really get a lot of press, but is, in my view, and I've listened to a lot of this stuff and I collect a lot of this stuff, one of the very best Bossa Nova records that ever was. But you can get it quite inexpensively, and came out in Colombia in and around not too long after that record comes out. And it's this record by Paul Winter. He's the guy on the left in the mohair sweater, and Carlos Lyra, who's the guy in the blue blazer on the right-hand side. Winter is an American. Lyra is a Brazilian singer. Winter's a saxophonist. Now, Winter had previously made a Bossa Nova record because he'd gone down early on to Rio in like 62 or 63, thought the music was great, hurried back to New York with a bunch of guys that he regularly played with who were kind of, college jazz musicians, and they made a Bossa Nova record, which was frankly pretty bad. That's his first effort. I forget what it's called, but I'll mention it in the notes. He then spends more time understanding the music, and then he goes down to Brazil, and this record is recorded not just with Carlos Lyra, who's a wonderful Brazilian singer, but also with Brazilian musicians. And not just any Brazilian musicians, because in addition to Winter and Lyra, Sergio Mendes is on piano, he of Mashkinada fame. Tchau Neto is on the bass, and he was the bass player on Getz Gilberto, and is basically the foundational bass player for the Bossa Nova style. And Milton Banana on drums, and again, another veteran of some really, really great Bossa Nova records. So these are A-listers when it comes to Bossa Nova, and this record is just terrific. And again, I would say it's the top 3 or 4 Bossa Nova U.S.-Brazilian collaborations, and there's some pretty tough competition there. So, and again, cheaply available. Pick it up while you can, because one day people are going to figure out, maybe because of this video, that it's really great. Okay, now the third last category I'm going to talk about is jazz funk. And last time I talked about one of my favorite records, Grover Washington's Mr. Magic. Talked about a Herbie Hancock record, Manchild, and Donald Byrd. I'm going to talk today about this record, which was done by a bunch of musicians that Herbie had worked with on his record, Headhunters, and they in turn formed a band called Headhunters. And so this is basically Herbie Hancock's group from the early mid-1970s without Herbie Hancock, and this is called Survival of the Fittest. This is one of the sweatiest, funk-drippinest, grooviest jazz funk records that you are ever going to hear. In particular, the first track, God Made Me Funky, is something, frankly, that you need to hear to decide whether or not you like jazz funk. If you haven't heard that track, I don't think you've really had the full experience. Anyway, wonderful, wonderful record. They did a follow-up, which was pretty good, but not quite as good as this one. And again, not widely appreciated, but excellent. The other record I'm going to mention, kind of an honorable mention for jazz funk, is this record by Idris Muhammad, House of the Rising Sun. This comes out on Kudu, which put out so much great jazz funk in the early part of the 1970s. This has got, again, all of this down here. These are all players in this. This has got the full kind of Creed Taylor in-house rhythm section, brass section, arrangers, reeds, violins, etc. So the full production here, but it isn't actually, weirdly, a record that sounds overproduced. And it's got just really banging tracks from start to finish here, not least of which is the title track, House of the Rising Sun, a really great interpretation. Anyway, Idris Muhammad, if you don't know him, find out and pick that record up. Now, I'm now going to sort of deviate from categories of jazz and make a recommendation by just basically a jazz giant, because why not? Because this is my video. And so I had last time out, when I got to this phase of the video, I made a recommendation for another Miles record, another Coltrane record. I'm going to make a recommendation here for a Miles record that if you don't have, you should have. Very important and very great record, and that's this record, Milestones, which is done with his sextet. Now, Miles is groups were always kind of fluid, and they were quite fluid between sort of 1957 and the early 1960s. But this is a wonderful version of his sextet, which has the classic rhythm section of the quintet, the first quintet, Red Garland on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. Coltrane is back in the fold here on saxophone, and the sixth member is Cannonball Adderley on alto sax. Most of these players would go on to be part of Kind of Blue shortly thereafter, but it's now pretty well acknowledged that this was the record in which modal jazz, that deviation from traditional chord progressions and really focusing on improvising across just one particular scale, this is where this approach to jazz really starts to flourish in Miles's playing. And the title track in particular, known as, well, it's called Miles in some releases, or Milestones on this release, is just superb. Anyway, grab it. Plentifully available and worth getting. And if that doesn't turn your crank, pick up a copy of this, Workin', which comes out a few years earlier, again with that first great quintet, with Coltrane, Garland, Chambers, and Jones. And if for no other reason, get this record for his treatment of the standard It Never Entered My Mind, which is one of the most beautiful moments in the whole discography of jazz writ large. So now we come to record number 10, and this is just a wild card category. It's just a record which is a great record. Part of it is kind of cool jazz, part of it is bossa nova. There's a little bit of jazz funkiness in there. There's a whole bunch of different pieces in it because it's a CTI record from, I think, 1969. And it's this record by Paul Desmond, who was, of course, better known as the alto saxophonist in the Dave Brubeck Quartet. And it's called Summertime. And it's a whole series of, well, of treatments of standards and pop songs, including things like Someday My Prince Will Come and Autumn Leaves, and even Obla Di Obla Da, everyone's least favorite Beatles song. But this is Desmond kind of nearing the end because he doesn't live, he lives only a few more years after this record. Just smoked too much and really paid the price for that, sadly. And he was kind of in retirement at this point and putting out records of really variable quality and kind of get-togethers, summit meetings with, this famous person, that famous person, so on, kind of retrospective or kind of, that kind of lifetime achievement sort of records. But this one stands out in the list of his post-Brubeck releases because the care given to his treatments of these standards and the quality of the production of this record are so magnificent that it really is just a record where you don't want to leave your turntable. You can just play it again and again and again. It is absolutely seductive. I think it was the All Music Review said Desmond's alto has never been recorded so ravishingly, and I think that's absolutely true. So there we are, 10 records with a bunch of extras thrown in because extra value is what this channel is all about. If you have thoughts about these records, if you have other suggestions for beginners for great records to pick up, please do mention them in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.